Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Stephanie Bree, and today I'm talking about Kevin Smith. And this is gonna be a pretty broad topic, but I don't want this video to be too terribly long. I'm gonna talk about my journey of discovery of Kevin Smith, the evolution of my experience with Kevin Smith, and my current feelings in regards to Kevin Smith. And so I want to start off by saying I am a child of the 90s. I watched a lot of MTV, and I had a vague familiarity with the characters Jay and Silent Bob because they did appear on MTV segments to promote Mallrats when Mallrats came out. However, being an R-rated movie, that I was not allowed to see, I did not go to Mallrats when it was new. And not knowing what Mallrats was, and being turned off by the presentation of the Jay and Silent Bob characters as they appeared on MTV, because I just thought they were stoner dudes, and I wasn't into comedy to begin with. And I certainly wasn't into stoner comedy. So things like Half-Baked or whatever, I never watched those movies. And I'm not likely to ever watch those movies. So growing up, I didn't experience Kevin Smith in the 90s when I should have. I just didn't. My first exposure to Kevin Smith proper came from a 2005 issue of Wizard, or 2004 or 5 issue of Wizard magazine, where they were talking about the recently released deluxe edition Jay and Silent Bob Strikes Back DVD 2-disc set that had just been released. And they did a whole write-up on all the movies leading up to Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. So they talked about Clerks, they talked about Mallrats, Chasing Amy, Dogma, and of course, Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. And because this was in Wizard magazine, and this was at the time, remember this was 2004 or 2005. I believe it was 2005, actually. I never made the connection that Kevin Smith, first of all, I didn't know who he was. I wasn't familiar with his name. But I never made the connection that his movies were comic book movies. Like I said, this was around the time where comic book movies were just becoming all the rage. We'd already had 2 or 3 X-Men movies. We already had the first of the Spider-Man movies. I believe Daredevil had already come out. Blade had already been a thing. I believe Batman Begins came out that year, if I'm not mistaken. So comic book movies were on the rise. So I remember thinking, oh, interesting. His movies are about comic books and comic book nerds, and I was a comic book nerd. So I started with Mallrats. I rented it from the video store, and I watched it, and I loved it. It wasn't so much the comedy, although it was funny. And like I said, I'm not a fan of comedies, but I can find some things humorous. Sometimes in small doses. But I did like the appearance of Stan Lee in the movie and the comic book references and how it felt kind of like a comic book adventure, with Jay and Silent Bob running around doing comic book things, superhero things. So I enjoyed the movie enough, and at this point I was in my early 20s. I enjoyed the movie enough to go ahead and check out the next one, Clerks. So I rented Clerks. And the first time I watched Clerks, I remember getting to the end of the movie and telling myself, you know what? I didn't like that one. I didn't like Clerks the first time I watched it. It just didn't do it for me. And so I wrote that off. And then I noticed that the next two were Chasing Amy, which was about a lesbian, and Dogma, which was about a pair of angels, and it was heavy Christian themed. But I was under the impression I was raised in a Baptist home, so we were very evangelical, that it was very anti-Christian or mocking Christianity. So I had an aversion to watching Dogma and also Chasing Amy because it was about a lesbian. But I went ahead and watched Chasing Amy anyways. And while internally I knew I was transgender at the time, I've known since I was 7 years old. I hadn't vocalized it yet. I hadn't told anyone. I hadn't even told myself yet. I knew it in my heart, and in my mind I always referred to myself in feminine pronouns. I didn't say the words, yes, I'm trans, or whatever, even in my own mind. So I had no concept of, later on I would discover that I was, bisexual, lesbian leaning bisexual, transgender woman. But the first time I watched Chasing Amy, I was enamored because it was like instantly it clicked with me. I was like, yes, this makes sense to me. Both on a comic book nerd level, seeing a behind the scenes of how indie comics are produced, but also on the whole discovery of the LGBT community, because I was discovering the LGBT community in secret, not telling my parents that I was exploring this. Since I did enjoy Mallrats, even though I didn't care for Clerks, and I really enjoyed Chasing Amy, I decided to give the next two a shot. So I did watch Dogma, and I hated it at the time, the first time I watched it. Didn't think it was funny at all. And felt like it had a little too much Jay and Silent Bob. So you can guess where I'm going with this. I did watch Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, and I didn't care for it either at the time. So I wrote Kevin Smith off. I was like, okay, he did Mallrats, that was good. Chasing Amy, that was okay. And everything else he did sucked. So I was like, well, 2 out of 5 I liked, and then the other 3 I didn't like. So mathematically speaking, I think it's safe to say, yeah, I'm not a fan of Kevin Smith. So I wrote him off. I had no further interest in Kevin Smith. And then one day it was 2006, so this would have been a year later. I was in my apartment with my sister and her roommate, because me and my sister and her friend all shared an apartment. So the 3 of us lived together. And somebody, either my sister or her roommate or one of their friends, somebody brought over a video of An Evening with Kevin Smith. Now, whereas I'm already not a fan of comedy, I'm extra not a fan of stand-up comedy. So I went into this expecting not to like it. I was pleasantly surprised at how smart he was and how much I did like it. And so I thought, maybe he's not a complete idiot. So this was around the time Jersey Girl came out on video. So I rented Jersey Girl. Not sure what to make of it. Watched it, and I remember thinking it was better than Clerks, but not as good as Chasing Amy or Dogma. So I thought, okay, fair enough. Kevin Smith isn't as bad as I thought he was, I guess. Then I found out, again through reading Wizard magazine, that Kevin Smith had transitioned from filmmaker to comic book writer. And so at this point, I was instantly like curious. Well, what's he writing? And then I found out he was writing Daredevil, and I had no fucking interest in Daredevil. So again, I wrote him off. I dismissed him. I was like, okay, maybe he's just a fad. a few years later, like more than 10 years later, I was having a conversation with a friend who was also a comic book nerd. And through our discussion, eventually we got to Kevin Smith movies somehow, and I don't remember how. And I remember distinctly saying I wasn't a fan of Kevin Smith, and my friend was taken aback. And they're like, "Oh no, you got to watch all his movies." And I replied, "I did. I watched them all. I liked Mallrats. I liked Chasing Amy. I didn't like the other ones." And they were like, "Oh no, you just missed the point." So this friend explained Clerks to me from their perspective. And so I decided to give Clerks a second chance. And I watched it a second time with what they said in mind. Now, at this point, I was more than a decade removed from the 90s. And a good 15 years removed from the 90s. And I had grown up. I had more life experience. I'd already gone to college, etc. So I was able to look at Clerks in a different light. And so this time around, I did find myself enjoying Clerks. And so again, I rewatched Mallrats and still enjoyed it. And I rewatched Chasing Amy and still enjoyed it. And I did rewatch Dogma and still didn't enjoy it. And I rewatched Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. And this time around, I was able to appreciate it a little bit better. Because I was able to connect the dots and see how it made not only references to the previous films, but also how the previous films foreshadowed Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back. Also, this was after the time the Sci-Fi Channel had done the Stan Lee Who Wants to Be a Superhero TV show. So I was more open to comic book content that wasn't like directly based on comic books, because comic book men hadn't come on the scene yet, I don't think, or I hadn't discovered it yet. But this was around the time one of my friends showed me Clerks 2, which I didn't finish. I started it, I got halfway through it, turned it off, and said, nope, not for me. And so I didn't wholesale write off Kevin Smith for a third time. This time I decided, okay, maybe I just didn't like Clerks 2. And so recently, as in this past fall, another friend of mine, a more recent friend of mine, who I've been watching movies with, had me watch Clerks 3 with her. And I was a little confused about what was going on in Clerks 3. But also, I was reminded of Clerks 1 and the 90s. And now, I'm in my 40s. Now I have more nostalgia for the 90s than I did, in 2005, where I was like trying to put the 90s behind me and forget about them. Now I'm reevaluating the 90s. And so I'm rediscovering things from the 90s that I either intentionally missed out on or just missed out on because I was into other things. And so now I can go back and rediscover things from the 90s that I didn't appreciate at the time, with a new light of appreciation for what they did, as well as a little bit more nostalgia. Maybe not necessarily specific nostalgia for the thing, in this case Kevin Smith movies, but the time. Nostalgia for the time. And so I decided to go back and rewatch the Kevin Smith movies, all of them. The New Jersey Chronicles. So I rewatched Clerks, still enjoyed it this time around. Mallrats, Chasing Amy, Dogma, still didn't enjoy Dogma. And then Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, Jay and Silent Bob the reboot. And then Clerks 2. I finally got to Clerks 2, and then this time I watched it all the way through. I still did enjoy Clerks 2 this time around. But I went ahead and watched a documentary on Kevin Smith, where I learned that he's actually made movies outside the New Jersey Chronicles. And so I learned of the other movies he has made, which I have yet to go back and rediscover. Partially because I'm kind of burned out on Kevin Smith, but also because they're in genres I'm not that interested in. So I'm not 100% sure if they're going to appeal to me. But between all of this, I got into podcasts. And at one point in time, I discovered one of the Kevin Smith podcasts. And it was entertaining and informative at the time for what it was. But after watching that documentary and getting a new appreciation for all the things he's done for the comics community and fandom as a whole, I can say this is my summary, and this is where I'm going to wrap up this video. I can appreciate what Kevin Smith did for laying the foundation in the 90s for the comic book movies that came out in the 2000s. I can appreciate that because he made movies for comic book nerds that, by and large, respect comic book nerds as people, as regular people. And I can definitely appreciate that because while they were outcasts, they weren't freaks necessarily. And so I can definitely appreciate that. As far as what he's contributed to comics, either as a writer or whatever, above and beyond that, all I can say is, yeah, he's had some success, but not in anything that interests me. So my assessment of Kevin Smith is, as a filmmaker, I feel mixed. I feel like he's a one-trick pony. He's really at his best when he's doing Giant Silent Bob movies. And whenever he ventures outside of that, I just feel like he's outside of his element.